I always preferred the late shift at the theater. It was quiet with only a few stragglers catching the final screenings. The hum of the projector, the rustling of popcorn bags, the occasional murmur from the audience. It was all predictable, comfortable. But that changed the night I saw him. It was just past midnight, and I was making my usual rounds, checking each auditorium before locking up. Theater 6 had played an old horror film that night, something obscure that only a handful of people had come to watch. When I stepped inside, the place was empty, except for one man sitting in the middle row, completely still, staring at the blank screen. "Sir, the movie's over," I called out. He didn't move. I took a few steps down the aisle, unease creeping up my spine. His posture was rigid, hands resting neatly on the armrests, head slightly tilted upward. I couldn't see his face from where I stood, but something about him felt wrong. I cleared my throat. "Sir?" The air felt thick, pressing against my skin. The silence stretched too long. My fingers twitched toward my radio, but before I could speak again, the lights in the theater flickered. And when they came back on, the seat was empty. I blinked. He hadn't passed me. I would have heard him move, seen him leave, but the row was completely deserted. The armrests still bore faint indentations, as if someone had just been sitting there. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I checked the security footage, scrubbing through the recording of Theater 6. I watched the audience file in, a small crowd, no more than 10 people. The movie played. I fast-forwarded to the end, waiting for the moment when I had walked in. The last customer left. The screen went dark, and then nothing. No one was there. I leaned in closer, my breath shallow. I had seen him with my own eyes. He had been there. But on the footage, the theater was completely empty. I replayed it over and over, each time feeling the same sickening chill deep in my bones. That night, I found myself lingering outside Theater 6 after the last showing. The place was supposed to be empty, but when I cracked the door open, the faint glow of the projector flickered across the screen. My heart pounded. I hadn't started another reel, and yet there was a film playing. I stepped inside cautiously. The screen showed grainy black and white footage of the theater itself, but from decades ago. The seats looked different, the decor older. People were watching a movie frozen in time. My breath hitched when I saw him, the man from last night, sitting in the exact same seat. I stepped closer, staring at the screen, my fingers digging into my palms. The film had no sound, just a faint crackling like something ancient and decayed. And then, the man turned his head, not on the screen, in the seat. He was there, in the exact same spot. His face was pale, almost waxy, his eyes hollow and sunken. He grinned, a slow, unnatural stretch of the lips, as if remembering something, as if recognizing. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering. The film on the screen stuttered, the image warping. The lights flickered again, and when they stabilized, the theater was empty. The seat was vacant. The film had stopped. I ran. I don't know why I kept coming back. Maybe part of me needed to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe it was something else, something pulling me back. The next night, I checked the footage again. The same thing. The audience left, the film ended, and the theater sat empty. But this time, at the very end of the recording, just before the feed cut out, a figure stepped into frame, standing in the middle row, staring directly at the camera. It was me. We weren't supposed to be in there. The old Regal Theater had shut down years ago, left to rot on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places that held a strange, lingering presence, like a place that had been forgotten by time. My friends and I had always talked about sneaking in, just for the thrill of it, but no one ever dared. Not until that night. It was Devin's idea. He was always the fearless one, the guy who'd do anything for a good story. "Come on, Riley, don't be a wimp," he said as he pried open the side door. I wasn't scared of getting caught. The cops didn't care about an abandoned theater, but something about the place made my stomach knot up. The way it just stood there, hollow and waiting, like it had been expecting us. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew clung to everything. Rows of empty seats stretched into darkness, the screen looming like a forgotten monument. Devin laughed as he stepped onto the stage, his voice echoing through the vast emptiness. "Welcome to tonight's feature presentation," he announced, his voice dripping with mock enthusiasm. Jessica and Ian chuckled, but I stayed quiet, my gaze fixed on the projection booth. The glass was smeared with dust, but behind it I could have sworn I saw movement, a shadow shifting just out of sight. Then the projector flickered on. None of us touched it. The machine whirred to life, casting a dim glow across the theater. The screen remained blank, but the film reel spun as if something unseen was preparing the show. "What the hell?" Ian muttered. Jessica backed up. "Guys, maybe we should—" The speakers crackled and the screen flared to life. At first, it was just static, waves of black and white noise rippling across the screen. Then, the image sharpened. It was us sitting in the theater. I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of sick joke is this?" Devin snapped, turning toward me. "Did you set this up?" I couldn't move. I could only watch as the film continued. It was us, just as we were now. The camera angle was from the front of the theater, filming us from the screen's perspective. We were sitting exactly as we were in real life, staring blankly ahead. Then, one by one, we started to change. On the screen, Ian's head tilted unnaturally to the side, his mouth stretching wide as if he were screaming. But no sound came out. Jessica's hands clawed at her throat, her eyes wide and bulging. Devin convulsed, his limbs twisting in impossible angles. And then, I saw myself. I wasn't moving, but something was wrong. On the screen, my head slowly turned to the left. In the real theater, I sat frozen, unable to look away. My on-screen self kept turning, until I was looking directly at the camera. And then I smiled. But I wasn't smiling. My real body was paralyzed, my breathing shallow, my pulse hammering against my skull. But the version of me on the screen leaned forward, grinning, and then it stood up. My heart stopped. The film version of me walked past my still-seated friends toward the screen. It grew bigger, closer, its expression warping into something unnatural. I could see every detail, the slight twitch of the lips, the hollowness of the eyes. And then it stepped out of the screen. The film stuttered and the projector cut off. Darkness swallowed the silence. No one spoke, no one moved. Then, a rustling, not from my friends, from behind us. Slow, deliberate movement. The faint creak of seats shifting, bodies settling in. I turned, my breath frozen in my lungs. The theater was no longer empty. Rows of figures sat in the seats behind us, completely still. Their faces were barely visible in the dim light, but their heads were all tilted at the same eerie angle, and they were all staring at us. Jessica whimpered. Ian grabbed my arm, his grip ice cold. Devin, who never got scared, was shaking. One of the figures in the back row stood up. A sharp breath cut through the silence. The figure took a step forward, then another, then another. I scrambled to my feet, yanking Jessica up with me. "Run," I whispered. We bolted. We didn't stop, didn't look back. We didn't pause at the door, didn't question how the lock we'd picked earlier was suddenly open wide, like something had been waiting for us to leave. We ran until our lungs burned, until we were far, far away from the Regal Theater. We never spoke about what we saw that night, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. The quiet rustling of seats, the faint sound of breathing just behind me. And when I pass by the abandoned theater, even though the doors are locked, I can still see it. The glow of a projector, and the faint outline of an audience that never left. I worked at a small-town theater for a little over a year, mostly running the late-night shifts. It wasn't a bad job. Sweeping up popcorn, refilling the butter machines, checking the auditoriums for stragglers before closing. Pretty easy work, but I started dreading Theater 3. It began with something small. One night, I walked in to do my final sweep, making sure everyone had left. The credits had rolled, the music was fading out, and the soft hum of the projector filled the empty room. At least, I thought it was empty. Then I saw him, a man sitting in the very back row. I almost missed him at first, because he sat so still. No movement, no shifting in his seat, just staring straight ahead at the blank screen. "Sir?" I called out. No response. I sighed, stepping farther inside. "Hey, buddy, we're closing up." Still nothing. As I got closer, a weird feeling crawled up my spine. His posture was unnatural. His shoulders were rigid, his hands placed perfectly on the armrest, fingers stretched out like he was gripping the seat. I couldn't see his face because his head was slightly tilted upward, watching the dark screen like the movie was still playing. I swallowed. "Sir," the air in the theater felt heavier, pressing down on me. I was about to reach for my radio when the lights flickered, just once. And in that brief moment of darkness, he moved, not a lot, just enough that I knew he wasn't sitting like that before. His head had tilted slightly lower, like he was starting to look at me. I felt a cold sweat break out along my neck. My gut screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt locked in place. Then the lights flickered again, and the seat was empty. I didn't wait. I bolted out of the theater, leaving the door swinging behind me. My manager gave me a weird look when I clocked out early, but I didn't care. I didn't want to be there anymore. The next night, I avoided Theater 3 as long as I could, but eventually I had to check it before closing. My stomach twisted as I stepped inside, half expecting to see him again, but it was empty. I let out a shaky breath and turned to leave, and then I saw it. The seat in the back row. The same one he had been sitting in. The armrests were scratched. Deep, jagged claw marks tore through the fabric, like something had been gripping it too hard. I told myself I was imagining, that maybe I hadn't noticed the damage before, but then the static started, a faint crackling sound, like an old TV struggling to find a signal. At first, I thought it was coming from the projector, but then I realized it was coming from the speakers. The screen flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the empty theater, and then a grainy black and white image appeared of the theater itself. My blood turned to ice. The camera angle was from the back row, like someone had placed it there, watching everything. The seats were empty. The aisles were empty. But then a figure walked into frame. Mr. I froze. The screen showed me standing in the exact same spot, staring at the exact same screen. But something was wrong. My on-screen self looked off. My arms were too stiff. My head slightly tilted, and then I started moving. Not in real life, just on the screen. My on-screen self slowly turned around, like I was looking over my shoulder at something behind me. I felt a cold breath on my neck. I ran. I sprinted out of that theater and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I didn't go back to work the next night, or the night after that. I quit. I don't know who or what that man was, but sometimes, when I drive past the theater late at night, I see the glow of the projector flickering through the windows, and I know he's still there, sitting in the back row, waiting for the next showing. I used to love watching movies alone in the theater. There was something peaceful about sitting in the dark, letting the world fade away as the story unfolded on the screen. It was my ritual. Late night showings, almost empty theaters, no distraction. Until that night. It was a midnight screening of some indie horror film that barely anyone had heard of. The kind of movie that got one showing before disappearing into obscurity. The ticket booth girl gave me a weird look when I bought my ticket, like she wanted to say something but decided against it. I should have paid attention to that. When I stepped into the theater, I felt a strange chill. It wasn't the usual blast of AC. This was something else, something deeper. The air felt thick, wrong. The room was nearly empty. Just me, a couple sitting near the middle, and one other person, an old man sitting in the very last row. I settled into my seat, pulling my hoodie tighter. The previews rolled, the lights dimmed, and soon, the movie started. At first, it was normal, but then I noticed something strange. The screen kept flickering just for a second at a time. Not enough to disrupt the movie, but enough to be off. And every time it happened, the picture seemed different. At first, I thought I was imagining, but then, during one of the flickers, I saw it, a new person sitting in the theater. I turned my head, my pulse pounding, but when I looked around, there was no one there, just me, the couple, and the old man in the back. I faced forward again, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. Flicker, another person. A few rows behind me, I sucked in a breath, my fingers digging into the armrest. I wasn't crazy. Someone else was. I turned again, nothing. The couple seemed unfazed, like they weren't seeing what I was. The old man in the back hadn't moved. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was just tired. Flicker. Closer. My breath hitched. The figure on the screen was now sitting directly behind me. I felt a rush of cold air against my neck. I didn't turn around this. I forced myself to face forward, my entire body rigid. My mind screamed at me to get up, to leave, but I was frozen in place. Flicker. My reflection on the screen was wrong. In the movie, there was a scene where a character walked through an empty theater. It was supposed to be a quiet, unsettling moment. But in the reflection of the theater seats, I saw myself sitting there with someone behind me, a shadow. No features, no face, just a dark, gaping void where a person should be. And then it moved, not on the screen, behind me. A slow, deliberate shifting in the seat. I heard it, a faint, raspy breath right against my ear. I shot up, heart pounding, stumbling over my own feet as I bolted for the exit. The couple gave me weird looks, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying to explain. I burst into the hallway, gasping for air. The concession stand was empty. The lobby was silent. I turned to look back at the theater. The old man was standing in the doorway, watching me. His face was pale, almost too smooth, like his skin didn't fit right. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, the entire eye. And then he smiled, not a normal smile. Too wide, too sharp. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, locking the doors, my hands shaking as I started the end. As I drove off, I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. The old man was still standing there, still smiling, and behind him, rows of shadowed figures standing in the theater, watching me leave. I used to be a projectionist at an old, nearly abandoned theater. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. The smell of stale popcorn, the hum of the reels spinning, the dim glow of the screen casting long shadows on the empty seats. We mostly played modern films, but sometimes we'd get old reels, the kind that came in rusted metal canisters with no labels. My manager told me to ignore them, said they were just forgotten studio reels that never got archived properly. One night during the last showing, I was up in the projection booth when I found one of those unlabeled reels sitting on the table. The film we were playing was already loaded, so out of curiosity, I held the old reel up to the light. The frames were strange. They weren't scenes from a movie. They looked like still shots of an empty theater. Seats, aisles, a blank screen. I thought maybe it was a security reel, something recorded by mistake. But then I noticed something off. In the last few frames, there was someone standing in the theater, not sitting, not walking, just standing, staring directly at the camera. A tall figure draped in what looked like a dark cloak. The last frame was nothing but a black screen. I felt a weird chill creep up my spine, but I shook it off. Just an old film, nothing special. Then the projector shut off. The theater below went completely dark. I cursed, checking the reels, but everything looked fine. The power hadn't gone out, the bulbs were still working. The film had just stopped playing. Then, over the intercom, I heard something. Soft, distorted breathing. My fingers hovered over the microphone. Hello? Someone still in there? No response. I switched to the security cameras and checked the feed for Auditorium 6, the one I had just been playing. At first it looked empty. Then, a single figure stood in the middle of the aisle, tall, cloaked, motionless. I blinked, my heart hammering. There was no way. I had checked the theater earlier. No one was there. Then, security feed. The figure was closer. I stood frozen, watching the static, crackled, flicker. Closer. I could almost make out a face, but hollow eyes. A mouth stretched too wide, frozen mid-screen. The figure was... The intercom screeched with static, and then, come up. I slammed the security feed and grabbed my hands were... I told myself I just checked the theater, see if someone had snuck in, then lock up. And I stepped out of the projection, the hallway with the poster on the walls. Instead of the latest, were old. Decades. The faces of the actors, their eyes blacked out. The carpet of the hallway and glow came. I didn't want every inch, but something pulled me forward. I was walking, and the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was packed. People sitting in. They sat stiffly, their heads tilted slightly upward, watching a blank white. Their skin was pale. Their clothes were outdated, like they had been there decades. My breath hit. The air was heavy, wrong. The smell of dust and sour. I turned to run. The doors slammed shut. The projector flickered on. I heard the reel clicking, and then I saw myself on the screen, standing in the projection, holding the old reel, watching the frame. My blood turned to ice. I turned, my heart pounding, but the theater was empty. All the people in this were gone. Projector whirred, the screen flickered, a still shot of except for a cloaked figure standing exactly watching. I don't remember how all I know is that I woke up out, my manager shaking me, telling me I quit that ass by the glow of the clicking of spinning on its own, and I know someone is still watching. I used to work at a small, rundown movie theater in my town. It wasn't anything special, just a cheap place where people came to kill time. Most of the seats were torn, the floors were sticky no matter how much we cleaned them, and the sound system was outdated. But the worst part? The man in seat 17. He started showing up during the late-night screenings. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people came alone to watch movies, especially at odd hours. But something about him was off. He never spoke, never bought concessions, never reacted to anything on the screen. He always sat in the same seat, seat 17 in Auditorium 3. The first time I saw him, I was sweeping the aisles after a late show. The credits had rolled and everyone had left except him. He just sat there, staring at the blank screen. "Sir?" I called out. "The movie's over." He didn't move. I felt a weird chill creep up my spine. Maybe he'd fallen asleep. I took a few cautious steps closer. "Hey man, we're closing up." Still nothing. I sighed, stepping into the row. "Sir, you..." The seat was empty. I blinked, looked around. He was gone. I hadn't looked away. I hadn't heard footsteps. He was just gone. That was the first time. It happened again the next night and the next. Every time I cleaned Auditorium 3 after the last showing, he'd be there, sitting in seat 17. Sometimes I'd see him come in when the movie started, just a shadow slipping into the row. But he never left, at least not when I was looking. One night I decided to test something. I waited until after closing, then pulled up the security footage from the projector room. At first it looked normal. People entered, found their seats, watched the movie. Then, at about 45 minutes in, the door at the back opened and a tall figure stepped inside. Seat 17. But when I fast-forwarded to the end of the film, something was wrong. As people got up and left, the footage skipped. A few seconds jumped forward, and the man was gone. No movement, no standing up, no walking away. One frame, he was there. The next, empty seat. My stomach twisted. The footage hadn't glitched anywhere else. Just in those few seconds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That night, as I locked up, I heard something, a faint scraping, like a chair being dragged across the floor. I turned toward Auditorium 3. The door was slightly open. A soft creaking sound echoed from inside. I should have just left, but I stepped inside anyway. The theater was dark, except for the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. The screen was blank. The seats were empty. All except one. Seat 17. Someone was sitting there, not moving, not breathing, just watching. The air felt thick, suffocating. I gripped my flashlight, took a slow step forward. My voice came out hoarse. "Sir?" The figure shifted, just slightly. My heart pounded in my ears. My hands were clammy. I raised my flashlight, and the seat was empty. I felt cold air rush past me like something had moved. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. The next day, I asked my manager about it. He went pale. "You saw him?" His voice was quiet. I nodded. "Who is he?" He rubbed his face, looking exhausted. "No one knows, but he's been here a long time." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He sighed. "This place was built over an old theater that burned down decades ago. A lot of people died that night. They say one of them never left." A chill crawled up my spine. "Seat 17? My manager just nodded. "I quit that week. I haven't been back since. But sometimes, when I pass by the theater late at night, I see a dim light flickering inside, and through the glass doors, in the darkness of Auditorium 3, I see a figure sitting in seat 17, watching." I never believed in ghosts, not really. But I also never believed I'd be the last person to see someone alive, or whatever version of them came afterward. It happened when I worked the closing shift at a small, struggling movie theater. We rarely had customers late at night, but one Friday, a man bought a ticket for the last showing of the night, a horror film in Auditorium 5. He was tall, gaunt, and had this strange, sunken look in his eyes. His clothes were a little too big, like he'd lost a lot of weight recently. He paid in cash, didn't say a word, and walked straight into the theater. Something about him gave me the creeps. I shrugged it off and went about my shift. But when the movie ended and I went in to clean, the man was still sitting there, motionless. The credits had finished rolling and the screen was dark, but he hadn't moved an inch. I cleared my throat. "Sir, we're closing." Nothing. I stepped closer. His posture was stiff, hands resting on the armrests, like he was still watching something. I felt my chest tighten. "Sir?" Still no response. I finally walked up to him, close enough to touch his shoulder. His seat was empty. I did not see him leave. I did not hear him move, but he was gone. The hair on my arm stood up. I spun around, checking the rows, the exits, even behind the screen. No one. I rushed back to the and checked the security camera. The feed showed the man sitting in seat 12. For a long time, he didn't move. Just sat there, staring forward, long after the movie ended. Then, at exactly 2:37 a.m., the feed glitched. For half a second, the screen was nothing but static. When the image returned, the seat was empty. No movement, no standing up, no walking away. One frame, he was there. The next, gone. I felt sick. I didn't sleep that. The next day, I looked up missing persons reports, and I found him. The man's name was Daniel Rourke. He had gone missing 3 years ago, last seen going to a late-night movie at a different theater. They never found his body, but somehow, he was still watching. I worked at a theater that was slowly being forgotten by the town. Business had been dropping for years, and the management was too cheap to upgrade anything. Everything still ran on old projectors, the seats were worn down, and the popcorn tasted stale even when fresh. But the worst part? There was a seat, a single seat in the middle of the theater that no one ever wanted to sit in. It wasn't that it was broken. It wasn't even particularly uncomfortable. But every night, without fail, it would be left empty. No matter how full the theater was, seat 13, people would purposely avoid it. Even if the theater was packed, there'd be an empty space in that one spot. It was like people instinctively knew not to sit there. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe the seat was cursed by some previous moviegoer, or maybe it was bad luck. But then, I started noticing something strange. Late night showings were always quieter. By 11 p.m., the place would be practically deserted, with maybe a handful of people coming to see whatever we were screening. But every time I checked the security footage, seat 13 would be occupied, but not by any regular person. The person sitting there was always someone different. The first time I saw it, I shrugged it off. A man around his 40s, wearing a dark jacket, was sitting in seat 13. He was watching the screen, but his face, his eyes, weren't focused on the film. They were staring at the person next to him, but with this strange, vacant expression, like he wasn't really there. When the movie ended, I went into the theater to clean, and there was no sign of him, no sign of anyone. I checked the footage again. He had never stood up. Just like that, gone. The next week it happened again. A woman, she had long, dark hair, a red scarf wrapped around her neck. She sat in seat 13, staring at the screen, but with an empty look in her eyes. She didn't react to anything. Her hands were folded in her lap, stiff, unmoving. And once the movie ended, I watched her leave the seat on the security feed. But when I went inside to check, she wasn't there. This time I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. Who were these people? Why were they always in seat 13? I did some research on the theater's history. Turns out, It had been built over the remains of a very old building that had once been a mansion. The mansion had burned down mysteriously years ago, and there were rumors of a curse that followed the property. People claimed that anyone who sat in seat 13 would become trapped in some kind of endless cycle, reliving a single moment of their life over and over again, never being able to leave. The curse of seat 13. I decided to see for myself. One night I stayed late. Everyone else had left the theater, and I snuck in with my flashlight. The auditorium was empty, the only sound the hum of the projector in the distance. I sat down in seat 13. At first, it felt like any other seat in the theater. A little uncomfortable, maybe, but nothing too special. I waited and waited. Minutes passed. But then, something shifted. The air around me grew thick, cold. I felt a pressure on my chest, like something was pushing down on me. The lights dimmed, and for a brief moment, the projector's beam flickered. And then, I saw them, the people who had sat in seat 13 before me. Their faces distorted, pale. They didn't move. They just stared at me. In the flickering light, I could see them, one by one, each person who had once occupied the seat. But now they weren't just watching the screen. They were watching me. Their eyes were wide open, unblinking. Their faces were frozen in expressions of pure terror, as though they were trapped in some kind of unending nightmare. I tried to get up. I tried to leave, but I couldn't move. I was stuck. I could hear them, whispers in the air, faint at first, then growing louder. Stay with us. Don't leave. I couldn't escape. I looked at the screen, the reel of the movie still running, but it wasn't the same film anymore. It was my face on the screen, the same terrified expression, wide-eyed, frozen in place. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection on the screen, I saw a person sitting beside me, but when I turned, the seat was empty. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Don't leave. Stay with us. And the last thing I heard before I finally blacked out was the sound of the seat creaking, as if someone was sitting down next to me. The next morning, I woke up in the theater, alone. The lights were on. The movie had finished. And when I stood up, I saw a single fresh footprint in the dust in front of seat 13. I've never gone back to that theater, but sometimes when I walk past it, I can swear I see someone sitting there, and I know I'm not the only. I've always worked late shifts at the local movie theater. It wasn't glamorous, just quiet, dark rooms filled with the hum of projectors and the occasional flicker of the screen. Most nights, I'd end my shift by cleaning up and shutting everything down before heading out to my car, alone in the empty parking lot. But one night, everything changed. It started out like any other late shift. I was assigned to Auditorium 2, which was nearly always empty. There was something eerie about that theater, its worn velvet seats, the musty smell in the air, and how the walls seemed to swallow sound. But it was easy work, and I had done it so many times before I hardly noticed. The film was a classic horror movie, nothing too special. The last group of people left, and I was getting ready to do my usual routine, sweeping the aisles, wiping the seats down. But as I was gathering the trash, something unusual happened. The screen, which had been blank for minutes after the credits rolled, suddenly flickered back to life. I turned toward the screen, startled. The room was completely empty, but there it was. The movie was starting over, the opening credits flashing across the screen again. I assumed it was a glitch in the system, so I walked up to the projector booth to fix it. But when I checked the controls, the film was still running. There were no buttons pressed, no one else in the theater. I turned to look at the screen again, confused. The scene was the same as it had been moments ago. People laughing, moving, talking, just like it had been the first time. Yet, something felt off. The sound was too muffled, the colors were too dim, and the characters on the screen were too still. As I watched, I noticed something unsettling. One of the characters on the screen was looking directly at me. It was a woman, her face frozen in fear, eyes wide. But it was almost like she was aware of me watching her. She wasn't blinking. She wasn't moving. I couldn't take my eyes off her. It was like she was trying to speak through the screen, but her mouth wouldn't move. I felt my chest tighten as I stood there, rooted to the spot. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. The air in the theater had become stifling, the oppressive silence consuming me. The woman on the screen began to shake her head slowly, as if warning me of something. Suddenly, I heard the faintest noise, a whisper. I looked over my shoulder, heart racing. Nothing. I turned back to the screen. The woman was gone, but the scene had changed. Instead of the film I had started watching, it was a completely different scene, one that I didn't remember from the movie. It was an old black and white clip of a man sitting alone in a dimly lit room. He was hunched over, staring at something, and as the camera zoomed in, I saw that he was staring directly at the screen, his eyes wide, his lips parted in a silent scream. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. I tried to shut off the projector, but it wouldn't stop. I couldn't get the machine to respond. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an unnerving tension that made my skin crawl. And then the man in the film started moving. He was no longer static. He stood up from his chair, his face contorted in terror, and began stumbling toward the camera. As he did, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned around, half expecting to see something or someone standing in the aisle behind me. But there was nothing, just silence. I turned back to the screen. The man was now just a few feet away from the camera, his mouth open wide in a scream, but no sound came from him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like something was pulling him forward against his will. And then, as he reached out toward the camera, I felt it, a cold hand pressing down on my shoulder. I spun around so fast, my heart in my throat. There was no one there. But the temperature had dropped. The room was freezing now, the breath visible in the air. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. I took a step back and tripped over a seat, falling to the floor. As I scrambled to get up, I glanced back toward the screen, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man on the screen, he was looking directly at me, not at the camera, not at the film. He was staring at me, his eyes wide in horror, his expression filled with desperation. And then slowly, he reached out toward the screen, his fingers twitching in the same jerky motions as before. Suddenly, I felt a cold wind rush through the room, extinguishing the lights and leaving me in total darkness. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded as I tried to find my bearings in the pitch-black theater. Then, the film stopped. It rewound. The sound of the reel turning backward filled the theater, and I felt a sickening chill seep into my bones. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The images flashed across the screen, faster and faster, until the rewind stopped at the moment the man had begun his scream. And then, I heard it. The whisper again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have come." I ran. I don't know how I made it out of the theater, but I found myself in the lobby, gasping for air. I had to get out. I had to leave. I couldn't even look back at the doors to the theater. When I finally did get outside and into my car, I thought it was over. I thought I was safe. But as I drove down the road, I glanced into my rearview mirror, and there, in the reflection, the woman from the film, staring at me from the back seat, her mouth open in a silent scream. I've always been fascinated by the art of cinema, how a movie could transport you to another world, make you feel every emotion, every fear, as if you were living it yourself. That's why I took the job as a projectionist at the old theater downtown. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it had its perks. The hours were long and the pay wasn't great, but I got to be alone with the films, alone in the dark. The theater had been around for decades. The place was stuck in the past, with its ancient projectors and outdated technology. I didn't mind. The creaking wooden floors, the musty smell of old velvet seats, and the dusty air made the theater feel like it had a soul of its own, a soul that had seen countless movies come and go, each one leaving a trace behind. But there was one thing that no one ever talked about: the special films. You see, every now and then, we'd receive a strange, unmarked reel. No title, no label, no information at all. The first time it happened, I assumed it was just a mistake. Someone must have dropped it off by accident. But when I asked the manager about it, he got strangely quiet and told me to just play it. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Just keep it running." I didn't ask any more questions. The first film I played was nothing special, at first. It started as a typical black and white movie, a period drama from the 1950s. But then, the actors started behaving strangely. They looked directly at me. I didn't know how to explain it, but as I sat in the projection booth, watching the film on the screen, the characters' eyes locked onto mine. It was as if they knew I was there, watching them. They didn't blink. They didn't move like normal actors. They seemed almost frozen in place, staring straight into my soul. I tried to focus on the film, but the unease grew. As the movie progressed, I noticed the characters' faces growing more distorted, their expressions twisted with fear and anguish. It was like the scene was shifting, warping into something darker and more sinister. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the screen went completely black. I thought the projector had malfunctioned, but the film was still running. The whirring sound continued, but there was no image. The darkness stretched on, endless. I tried to rewind the reel, but it wouldn't budge. I checked the machine, but everything seemed to be working fine. The whispers started then. At first, they were faint, like murmurs in the background, but soon they grew louder. The voice sounded like someone else was in the booth with, "You shouldn't have played the film." I froze, my heart racing. The voice was chilling, as coming from inside my head. I turned around, but the booth was empty. No one was there. The whispers kept getting louder, until it felt like they were surrounding me. And then, The screen flickered back to life, but the film had changed. The characters weren't actors anymore. They were real. The faces were distorted, like I was seeing them through a dirty glass, but they were still watching. I could see their lips moving, but no sound came from the speakers. They seemed to be talking directly to me, pleading, begging for help. Their eyes were wide with terror, their mouths stretched open as if they were screaming, but no sound reached my ears. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of film reels in my panic. I tried to shut off the projector, but it wouldn't stop. The film kept playing faster now, the images flashing by in a blur of grotesque faces and twisted scenes. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the faces, one of the actors, was standing right next to me. I didn't know how, but she was there, her eyes locked on mine. Her mouth moved silently as she was trying to say something. No words came. She reached out toward me, her fingers elongating, her skin stretched and contorted, as though she were part of the film and part of the real world at the same time. I screamed, backing away, but she was too close now. Her hand brushed against my face, cold and clammy, and the moment her fingers touched me, everything stopped. The screen went black, the whispers ceased, the projector shut off, and I was left in complete silence. I sat there trembling, not knowing what had just happened. I couldn't explain it. I was certain that I had just hallucinated, but I knew that wasn't true. The chill in the air, the feeling of her fingers on my skin, the way the characters on the screen had looked at me, it was real. The next day, I went to the manager. "I need to know what's going on," I said. "What is this film? Why did it change?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at me with those dark eyes of his. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "That film is cursed. It's been here for as long as the theater has been open. No one knows where it came from or who made it, but it's been passed down from projectionist to projectionist. If you play it, you're bound to it." "Bound to it?" I asked, confused. He looked away as if afraid to speak any further. "It's too late now," he muttered. "Once you've seen it, you're a part of it. You'll never be able to leave the theater." Not truly. I couldn't understand what he meant. But that night, when I returned to the theater for my shift, I began to feel it. The theater was different. The air was thicker, heavier. The lights flickered as I walked through the empty halls. And then I heard it. The whispers. They were back. This time, I couldn't ignore them. They were calling my name, drawing me toward the projection room. And as I entered, I saw the film reel on the machine, waiting for me. I knew then that I could never leave. I had become part of the film, just like the others. The cursed reel had claimed me, and now I would be stuck in this dark, haunted place forever, doomed to watch the movie play over and over again, with no escape. And as I sat in the projection booth, waiting for the screen to flicker to life again, I knew one thing for sure. The movie was always watching me. It was my first night working at the old cinema in the heart of town, the kind of theater where the seats creaked and the lights flickered every now and then. I had heard rumors about the place, stories of people who swore they had seen things they couldn't explain, things that made them never return. But desperate for a job, I brushed it off as local legend. The theater had a strange schedule. The regular movies played during the day, but every so often, the manager would schedule a midnight showing, a special screening that wasn't advertised. No one really knew what those films were. The few employees who had worked there longer than me refused to talk about it, acting like it was an unspoken rule never to ask. Curiosity gnawed at me, and despite my growing unease, I worked my first shift. The theater had a quiet, almost eerie vibe, especially after the last group of moviegoers. I was the only one left in the building when I noticed something odd. The lights in the lobby flickered before dimming, casting long shadows that seemed to move with me as I walked. As the clock ticked past midnight, I heard the familiar hum of the projector starting. I wasn't sure who had come in to watch the film since the theater was completely empty, but the manager had left me to handle everything on my own. The screening room was always eerily silent, except for the occasional hiss of the projector. I walked to the back of the theater to check the projector, and when I did, I saw something unsettling. The reel wasn't one I had loaded earlier that day. This one was old, marked with strange, faded handwriting. I couldn't read it clearly, but there was a name scribbled across the label, one that I didn't recognize. I hesitated, but ultimately shrugged it off. It was probably just a mix-up, right? I pushed the strange feeling in my gut aside and pressed play. The film started, and at first, it seemed like any old black and white movie, a noir thriller, dark and gritty. The opening scene showed a man walking through a dimly lit alley, the shadows stretching long across the walls. But something was wrong. The more I watched, the more the characters on the screen seemed too real. The man in the alleyway turned to look directly at me, his eyes wide with fear, and his lips trembled as if he wanted to scream but couldn't. I froze in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. The scene began to unfold, but it wasn't like a normal film. It was alive. The camera angles changed, not in the usual cinematic style, but in a way that felt like the camera was moving toward me. The man in the film reached out, and just as his fingers brushed the screen, a chilling, unnatural cold spread through the theater. I could feel it in my bones, freezing me in place. The air turned stale, and the sound of the film warped, like it was distorted, muffled by some unseen force. The man's lips moved, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. The room seemed to echo with a low hum, a hum that was somehow both distant and right beside me. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen to the floor. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My body felt like it was being pulled into the screen. I blinked hard, trying to shake off the dizziness, but the room felt smaller, the walls closer. Then, suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the theater into darkness. I heard soft footsteps behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone there, but the room was completely empty. My heart raced and panic set in. I had to leave. I needed to get out. The air felt suffocating now, and the shadows seemed to move and stretch unnaturally around me. I ran toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle refused to turn, as if some invisible force was holding it shut. I was trapped. Then, the screen flickered back to life. The scene had changed, and now the man was standing in front of a door. My door. He stared at it, his eyes wide with horror, just like the way he had looked at the screen before. The camera zoomed in on his face, and his mouth moved, silently screaming for help. The temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding me. The man on the screen reached for the door, his fingers pressing against the glass, just as I pressed against mine. I could almost feel the cold, the same chill that now surrounded me, running through my veins. I couldn't breathe. The door finally opened, but instead of the theater lobby, I saw another hallway, dark and endless, stretching into oblivion. The man on the screen stepped into the hallway, and I watched in paralyzed fear as his silhouette disappeared into the darkness. The screen flickered again, and then he was gone. The whispers grew louder. I turned, heart pounding, and found myself alone in the theater once more. The lights flickered back on, and the hum of the projector stopped, but the air was still cold and suffocating. I stumbled toward the door again, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. But when I opened it, the scene outside was different. I wasn't in the theater anymore. I was in the alleyway from the movie. The shadows pressed in around me, and I could hear the sounds of distant whispers, and the temperature had dropped so low I could see my breath. My heart raced. Looked around. There was no way out. The alley seemed to stretch on forever. In the distance, I could see the same man from the film, now walking toward me, his face twisted in terror. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. As he neared, his eyes locked onto mine, and I realized that it wasn't the film that had trapped me. It was the theater itself. I was part of it now, a part of the endless film that played at midnight, drawing in those who dared to watch it, pulling them into the movie forever. I turned to run, but the walls of the alley closed in on me. The whispers grew louder, suffocating. The door behind me slammed shut with a finality that sent shivers down my spine. I was trapped in the movie now, just like everyone else before me. The screen will keep playing, and the next person who watches will be pulled into the darkness too. And now, as the clock strikes midnight, the movie begins again. I'd worked at the old movie theater for months, but I'd never felt the way I did that night. It was the last shift of my part-time job before I left for college. I'd heard the rumors about the place, the ghost stories, the strange occurrences, the unsettling presence that seemed to hang over it, but I had always dismissed them as nonsense. I loved the quiet, dim atmosphere of the theater. It was the perfect place for me to get some peace and focus after a long day of school. The theater itself was an ancient building, nestled on the edge of town. It had been around for over 70 years, and it had seen better days. The seats were old and worn, the walls lined with faded posters, and the projector room smelled faintly of dust and old film reels. Most of the time I was alone, especially after the last movie of the night when everyone had left. The late shift was usually peaceful, except for one odd detail. There was always one seat in the back of the theater that never seemed to be occupied. It was the very last row, the corner seat, closest to the exit. No one ever sat there, ever. It didn't matter how many people showed up or how full the theater was. That seat remained empty. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but as the weeks went by, I started to feel watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was always staring at that seat. On my last night, the last movie ended, and the few remaining patrons filed out into the lobby. The theater was nearly empty, save for me. I made my usual rounds to clean up the seats and check the projector before I locked up for the night. That's when I noticed something odd. The last seat, the one that was always empty, was occupied. My heart stopped for a moment as I walked closer. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. He was sitting perfectly still, facing the screen, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He didn't move, not even to acknowledge my presence. I felt a chill in the air as I approached, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Excuse me," I called out softly, unsure whether he was real or if I had simply imagined it. There were no other cars in the parking lot, no sign of anyone else in the building. How could he have gotten in without me seeing? He didn't answer. I called out again, this time a bit louder, but there was no response. I hesitated. Maybe he was just another late moviegoer who had gotten lost in the darkness of the theater. I decided to approach him and ask if he needed help. When I reached the row, I felt an icy sensation run through my body. The air was unbearably cold now, and the man still didn't move. I was standing right beside him, looking down at his face. His features were shrouded in shadows, but his eyes were empty, holes, dark and hollow, where his eyes should have been. I recoiled, a gasp escaping my lips, my blood turning to ice. His face was pale, and there was a faint smile on his lips, a twisted, unnatural smile that made me feel sick to my stomach. I backed away quickly, but my foot caught on something. I stumbled and fell, my hand hitting the floor in a desperate attempt to steady myself. As I regained my balance, I looked up, and the man was gone. The seat was empty. I stood frozen for, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I looked around the theater, but there was no one else in sight. I stumbled toward the exit, desperate to leave. But as I reached for the door, I saw something that froze me in place. The last seat was no longer empty. It was filled again, but this time, the man wasn't sitting in it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. My body was completely paralyzed. I felt like I was trapped in a dream, a nightmare where I couldn't wake up. The man's hollow eyes, the twisted smile, it was all coming back to me. His cold presence still lingered in the air. I couldn't look away from the seat, from myself sitting there, staring at the screen. It was as if I had become part of the theater, part of the very fabric of it, condemned to sit there for eternity, just like all those before me. Then, the whispers became soft at first, like a breath on the back of my neck, but soon they grew louder, louder than the hum of the projector, until the sound filled the entire theater. The whispers were speaking my name, calling me, beckoning me back to my seat. I tried to move, to scream, to fight it, but I couldn't. I was stuck. I was the last person in the theater now, and I was never going to leave. The whispers became screams. The seat beneath me became unbearably hot, as if the fire of some unseen force was burning me from below. I tried to escape, but the walls began to close in. The screen flickered, showing distorted images of faces, people who had sat in that same seat before me, people who had never left. They were trapped here, just like I was. The lights flickered out, plunging the theater into darkness, and in that darkness, I felt the cold fingers of the man from before, his presence pressing in on me from every direction. I was him. I was the one who would never leave the seat. I was the one trapped in the theater, the last person to sit there, and I would never leave, not until the next person came, sitting in the very same seat, becoming the next victim of the theater's curse. The last seat in the theater will always be occupied by whoever dares to sit there, unaware that they're part of a legacy they can never escape. And when you leave nothing but your memories, stuck on the screen for all eternity.